Well, thank you everybody for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm glad you guys are putting this together. I study education policy, and I'm specifically interested in global education reform. So one of the things I always tell my students is a good way to evaluate a policy is to evaluate it on its own merits. So what I want to talk about is give you kind of a very broad perspective on what is it that school choice advocates say this policy is going to do and show you the evidence. So proponents say that if you introduce school choice, two things are going to happen. First, these new private schools, whether they're private schools participating in a voucher program or charter schools, the argument is that they're going to outperform public schools. And more importantly, they're going to incentivize public schools to work harder. Meaning the idea is that this competition is going to lead to overall test scores increasing. So if you look at student assessment, the idea is that test scores are going to go up. The second thing is that they argue that this increase in test scores, this systemic improvement, is going to help resolve historical inequalities in our school system, meaning it's specifically going to benefit students living in poverty and students of color from marginalized communities. So to put it simply, it's going to lead to greater achievement and greater equity. So to give you some perspectives on this, I want to use two examples from two of the largest and oldest experiments that I can think of in school choice policies, okay? The first one is in Milwaukee. Milwaukee introduced a citywide voucher school program in 1990. In 1990, Milwaukee public schools were low performing and profoundly unequal. And what they look like today is that they are low performing and profoundly unequal. And more importantly, if you compare the private schools that are competing with public schools, there's no difference in terms of achievement scores. So if you look at the percentage of students in Milwaukee that are rated as being proficient in mathematics, it's 14% in the private voucher schools and 15% in the public schools. If you look at the percentage of students that are rated as proficient in reading, it's 19% in the private voucher schools and 20% in the public schools. So what you've seen over 30 years, I mean, we've had 3 decades now to see how this would play out. You haven't really seen any systemic changes. And more importantly, those private schools are not outperforming the public schools. The second example I want to give you comes from Sweden. And I know a lot of Americans are surprised to hear this, but Sweden introduced a nationwide voucher program back in 1992. Sweden, like other Nordic countries, does not give standardized assessments. So teachers, eat your heart out. No standardized assessments over there. But they do participate in PISA, and that stands for the Program for International Student Assessment. It's put on every 3 years by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So what does PISA tell us about Sweden? Well, the first year PISA was administered was in the year 2000. And Sweden was one of the highest performing countries in the world. It was up there with other Nordic countries such as Finland, for example. But interestingly, over the past 20 years, what you've seen is a fall in performance in Sweden, a pretty significant one. And today, Sweden performs basically alongside the United States and the UK, which for Nordic countries, that's kind of scandalous, right? So just to give you some perspective, their average reading score was 506, the average math score was 502, and their average science score was 499. The United States, by comparison, is 505, 478, and 502 by comparison. So again, with Sweden, you're not seeing an increase in achievement. You've actually seen a pretty significant decrease. But let me talk about the equity argument, because this is the one that I think is most troubling. When you look at evidence in Milwaukee, Sweden, and really everywhere across the United States, whether it's voucher programs, charter school programs. And like I said, I study international comparative ed. Chile, Mexico, many other countries have experimented with these school choice policies. Not only do you not see any change in overall achievement, one thing that you do see is student sorting. And what I mean by that is segregation. Because what happens when you introduce school choice is that not all families and not all parents are equally positioned to take advantage, so to speak, of these choice policies. It's those parents and those families that have the most education, the most income, things of that nature. They're the ones that are able to take advantage of these programs. And what you'll see is if you dig into the research, there's a term that you'll see pop up. It's called cream skimming. And what that means is that when you introduce these schools of choice, they're able to skim the cream off the top, meaning the highest performing, easiest to educate students. And the disturbing part is what that means is it leaves behind struggling students. Those students who have the most needs and the most challenges, it leaves them behind in a public sector that is shrinking, meaning it's losing funding. So you're basically concentrating the students who need the most in a shrinking public sector. So the point I'm trying to get across to you here is that on its own merits, this is a bad idea. There's little reason to believe that choice is going to lead to overall improvement, and there's good reason to believe that it's going to increase social segregation. And in a nation like ours, in the United States and here in Iowa, we're already segregated. We're segregated along the lines of social class, race, and ethnicity in many different intersecting ways. And if we do this, all we're going to do is contribute to that further. So this idea that it's going to lead to improvement and greater equity, it's just simply misguided. We need a new way to talk about school improvement, and this isn't it. Thanks, y'all.
Scott, thank you so much for joining